And welcome everyone. My name is Jaswinder Bakshi, Head of Finance Panel ICMA and Head of Construction Equipment Finance and Tata Capital. And I have the pleasure of welcoming all the participants. Mr. Sandeep Ghosh, who is just joining, he's the co-convener of the Finance Panel and also Head of Corporate Strategy and Planning with Shrey Equipment Finance Limited. And we also have with us subject matter experts from Deloitte India, whom I'll introduce in a while. ICMA today is a 70-member strong association of construction equipment manufacturers, component manufacturers, and financiers. CE industry has been growing at a great pace till 2018-19. The industry directly contributes to the infrastructure development, employment generation, and skill development for the country. The year 1920 was seen to be just a small bump in the otherwise smooth upward journey till the world and India got hit by one of the world's worst health and economic crisis. So COVID-19 has changed the way we all used to think and work. ICMA adapted to the new normal very, very fast. And I'm proud to say that our activity levels of all the panels of ICMA have increased in last 6 months. And we have had various webinars, seminars in our last few months. On 18th of August, our government panel organized an extremely encouraging webinar with Mr. Mekapati Gautam Reddy, Honorable Minister from Andhra Pradesh. ICMA also directly contributed to the cause of supporting some of the government departments by donating PPE kits, etc. COVID has affected not only our customers but our members also, and we thought we should discuss on ways how we can learn in managing our liquidity better and learn about developments in the direct and indirect taxation regimes. The topic for today's discussion is India tax, COVID impact, liquidity opportunities, and other ideas. We have with us today Ms. Bella Sheth Rao, who is a partner of Deloitte India. She is a chartered accountant by profession and experienced in industry and consultation practice. The subject matter experts for today's session are Mr. Hardik Gandhi, Mr. Shrenik Shah, and Mr. Jimit Devani. Mr. Hardik is a chartered accountant and has a vast advisory and compliance experience with respect to several indirect taxes, including service tax, excise duty, customs duty, and foreign trade policy. Shrenik is a accountant with vast experience in tax technology, due diligence in mergers and acquisitions and compliance areas. Mr. Jimit is a chartered accountant and master's in law with vast experience in direct taxes and international taxes. He specializes in domestic and international tax compliance and advisory matters. I'd like to take a moment to highlight that all the participants are on a mute mode. If you have any content related questions during the session, type in your queries in a Q&A chat box on the right side of the screen. We'll do our best to respond to your questions during this presentation. The topics taken up by our speakers are based on discussions around our industry, issues, and recent developments. I will hand it over to Bella to take this presentation ahead. Yeah, Bella.
Thank you, Mr. Bakshi, and thank you once again for providing Deloitte this opportunity to be the knowledge partner on your tax webinars. This is the first of a series of 2 webinars that we plan to hold with ICMA. This webinar will focus on indirect and direct taxes, and the next webinar will focus on employee taxation and transfer pricing. So the session today is for about 75 minutes, and for the first 60 minutes, we will be presenting on the various topics that we zeroed in based on discussions with industry members. The balance 15 minutes will be a Q&A, and as Mr. Bakshi said, we do request participants to please type in their questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we will address them in the Q&A session. So we do have a packed agenda, so let's begin. Now, the first few slides, I will just take you through the journey of GST. It's important to understand how the law has evolved, where is it heading, what more can we expect from GST, and then we come to certain specific, agenda items that we have to discuss. So moving on, next slide, please. GST, it's been a momentous journey. GST is 3 years old now. 1st July 2020 is the 3rd anniversary for GST. It's been a momentous journey for India, and to me, one of the biggest successes of GST is that it gave birth to what is now called cooperative federalism. It's where the centers and the state came together to decide on fiscal policy, the first of its kind, and it was considered an experiment, but now it's a model that's working extremely well. And as we've seen in the last 3 years, with the meetings of the GST Council, which have been over 40, that means more than one meeting a month in the last 3 years. And most of the decisions of the council have been taken via unanimous decisions, except last one on lotteries where there was voting. So clearly, there is consensus that is being built for the GST law, which is good news for all of us. Also, there's a lot of action that has happened on the administrative side. We've had about more than 850 notifications or circulars, which means the law is evolving and will continue to evolve. Though these were issued with the intent to clarify the law, in certain cases, they've created more confusion or they have brought about less of clarity. And therefore, we will see the space evolving. We've also seen a number of advanced rulings, over 1,000, again, all done to bring about clarity, but there is more confusion with divergent views. And there is a push now to set up the centralized appellate authority, which was discussed in the last budget. And we do hope to see it being set up very soon to bring consistency in the advanced ruling decisions. During the implementation of GST, the government had set up committees to discuss industry-specific issues and to address them in the policy. And I think there is a need now again for the government to revisit that. It's been 3 years, certain issues are still existing and new issues have come about, and the government does need to look into these issues again. And so these committees probably need a resurgence. Unfortunately, we also have seen writ petitions being filed, a number of them, and some have reached the Supreme Court as well. So clearly a 3-year-old law has generated a lot more litigation than the government would want, but it is what it is for now. The other big news around GST is on anti-profiteering. It was brought in to protect consumer interests, but may not have achieved its purpose considering most of the decisions are being litigated. And the anti-profiteering law itself may have outlived its usefulness, is again my personal view. Moving on, these are just some data points around GST as to what is happening on the policy side, on the procedural side. But the one big takeaway for me on GST, again, besides cooperative federalism, is the fact that it's given a big push to automation. GST has made all of us as taxpayers, as consultants, look at automation, for our compliances. And that platform of GST is only expanding with, the introduction of e-invoicing. I think automation is good news for the tax administration as it can, stop the leakages of tax, and also for the taxpayer as it brings about transparency in the way we deal with the tax office. A number of challenges still pertaining, so we will see a lot more in the GST law. We do see the law changing, evolving for some time. The one big move under GST that is really, that the industry is keen for is to introduce the oil and gas sector into GST, which has been completely left out, and it does have a cascading impact on the entire industry. So that is one big area of concern, and hope the government does something about it. But moving on, let's move on, to the other the other big policy decision that the government has been making around Atmanirbhar Bharat, and the key one under that is Make in India, which is relevant to all of us. So Atmanirbhar Bharat has 5 pillars of economy, infrastructure, systems, vibrant demography, and it has 5 phases. Under which the implementation has to happen. But as I said, that we will focus on the key focus on Make in India that the government has been has been pushing for. This time, it does look that the government is working in a targeted fashion to address the issues related to industrial production, which is land, labor, power, capital, logistics, and infrastructure via the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, which is good news for the industry because this does give us a standing and a good chance to sort of get some of the action from China because news reports do suggest that manufacturing industries in China are looking at a China plus one, strategy for their manufacturing hubs. And if India is able to put its, to get a comprehensive support on Make in India, then we could become an attractive destination for manufacturing in India. The government has also introduced a number of schemes for certain industries, the profit-linked incentives being introduced for electronic sector, for the pharma sector, for the textile sector. Again, a big push for the Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India initiatives. Besides that, the government has also introduced a number of policies which we will discuss later on in the presentation around lower tax rate for manufacturing industry, the inbound manufacturing scheme, the authorized economic operator scheme, all of which have will again give a fillip to the manufacturing industry. So moving on from here, the other topic that we would like to discuss today is around free trade agreements. Now, free trade agreements are, what are free trade agreements? They are agreements between two or more countries to reduce trade barriers, eliminate trade barriers. India, there are number of types of free trade agreements, as you see listed on your screen. Free trade agreement is considered one of the most effective tools to promote and enhance cross-border trade. And what is the benefit of a free trade agreement? The key benefit is a preferential tariff for negotiated tariff lines, but subject to country of origin rules. So clearly, free trade agreements are again making a resurgence, and you may be aware that in the last budget, the country of origin rules were made stricter, though they have yet to be notified. But free trade agreements is something that organizations and industries should look at to reduce cost of manufacturing and also to bring efficiency in their supply chains. Moving on, India has signed a number of free trade agreements with the ASEAN countries, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and the SAARC countries, and is looking at and is in negotiations with a number of other countries as well, including Australia, UK, US. So India is focusing on free trade agreements as a way forward to improve trade relationships with a number of countries. Specific to the construction equipment industry, the agreements with the ASEAN countries and Japan could provide, preferential tariff regimes, which could be beneficial and therefore should be explored. Moving on. We will now come to the inbound manufacturing scheme, and I will hand it over to the subject matter expert, Hardik, who will take us through this and certain other schemes as well. Hardik, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bela. So I would like to take you through the scheme of inbound manufacturing and its potential benefits, not only to manage the short-term liquidity challenges, but also to optimize the tax incidence from a long-term standpoint. The scheme of inbound manufacturing is essentially based on the overall theme of Make in India and is with a strategy and a purpose to promote India as a global manufacturing hub. Now, the interesting concept of this scheme is that it allows import of raw materials without payment of customs duty for carrying out any manufacturing or any other operations in a bonded facility. Moreover, from a capex standpoint, this scheme also allows import of capital goods without payment of customs duty. Now, these import duties stands fully remitted if the final product or the finished goods or the imported goods such as raw materials or components are eventually exported. Import duty on inputs stands payable only if the finished goods or imported inputs are cleared in the domestic market. More importantly, these import duties are payable only at the time when the finished goods or imported goods are cleared in the domestic market. So this gives a good benefit of duty deferment till the time the finished goods or the imported goods are cleared as such in the domestic market. For instance, duty on imported components or raw materials which is used in manufacturing of an equipment could stand deferred till such equipment is cleared in the domestic market. And in case of exports of such equipments, duty on such components or raw materials will stand fully exempted. So let's see some of the key benefits of this scheme. The first and foremost benefit is that it helps unlock the working capital. This scheme essentially provides improved liquidity as the payment of the import duty on inputs as well as capital goods stands deferred till either the goods are exported or these goods are cleared in the domestic market. More importantly, there is no interest on import duty, since it, unlike any other schemes, where typically the warehousing period is, say, for example, 90 days, beyond which interest is applicable. Another interesting point over here is duty on capital goods which are imported also stands deferred till the same are cleared from the bonded warehouse. Again, interest is not applicable on such import duty, which is paid at the time of clearing such capital goods in the domestic market. Now, this looks to be quite a substantial benefit for businesses having expansion plans or looking at replacement of plant and machinery in near future. Another important point and a benefit is that there is no condition for having foreign exchange. There is no condition whereby exporter is obligated or required to receive the remittance for exports in convertible foreign exchange. More importantly, unlike other existing schemes such as EOU or Special Economic Zone, there is no obligation even to maintain positive net foreign exchange. This is a big plus to this scheme because it also allows clearances to the domestic market without maintaining any obligation of positive NFE. Moreover, goods can also be procured from the domestic market, which can be used in manufacture and even carrying out any other operations which are permitted under the scheme. As I said, there is no export obligation, and this scheme essentially enables efficient capacity utilization, as there is no limit on the quantum of the clearances that can be exported or the quantum of clearances which can be made to the domestic market. So clearly there is no obligation to export. So even if there are 100% domestic sales, this scheme can still be utilized provided if there are any goods which are imported, such as raw materials or components or spare parts. Now, overall, this scheme comes to be a good alternative to existing schemes such as EOU or SEZ. This can be evaluated in place of EOU or SEZ, as this scheme involves comparatively simpler compliances and fewer regulatory interference. There is also no investment threshold in terms of capex. Moreover, the most interesting aspect is that this scheme is not only beneficial for setting up new facilities, but even the existing manufacturing facilities can also be bonded and permission can be obtained. Say, for example, a manufacturer can bond the existing manufacturing facility, obtain a permission for inbound manufacturing, and enjoy all the benefits under the scheme. Now, another important aspect, which is always one of the pain points, is the ease of compliance and the regulatory interface. This is a big shift from the conventional physical-based control to an accountable-based control for export schemes. There is a single application cum approval form with a single point of contact for all approvals. The records for clearances can be maintained in an electronic format, and all filings are to be made in an electronic format, which helps ease of doing business and also brings simplicity and transparency in the compliances. Overall, in my view, given the benefits as well as the simplicity and ease of compliance, it would be a good idea for members to evaluate and assess the benefits of this scheme. Government and the board are also quite receptive to provide any clarification as may be needed and remove any impediment operationalizing this scheme. So these are some of the good benefits which comes out of this inbound manufacturing scheme, and perhaps members can look at getting into this scheme. Moving on to the AEO scheme. Now today, supply chain is not merely perceived as a cost of doing business. Essentially, it's now a competitive differentiator. AEO certification encourages compliance companies to ensure compliance and increase security in their international supply chain. Yes, of course, it comes in exchange of incentives which will improve the efficiency of supply chain by mitigating any risk and ultimately obtaining the costs in the supply chain. Now, AEO certification provides businesses with an internationally recognized security standard and certifies an entity as a secure and a reliable trade partner. The AEO program launched by the Government of India is a step towards trade facilitation as well as ease of doing business. Essentially, AEO is nothing but some sort of a certification for the supply chain, which is more or less similar to an ISO certification for a manufacturing process. Now, obtaining AEO status or a certification is not mandatory, but it's a commercial decision. However, one of the emerging trends which we are seeing right now is that in the supply chain is that if AEO certified entities generally prefer doing businesses with other AEO certified entities. Now, the next big question would be that who can get this AEO certification? Importers, exporters, or even logistics providers can obtain AEO certification. There are 3 levels of AEO certification, or we call it as 3 tiers of AEO certification, which are namely AEO Tier 1, AEO Tier 2, and AEO Tier 3. The benefits and the incentives offered by the government differ across all levels. Now, the success of the AEO scheme is evident from the fact that today, as we speak, there are around 3,000 plus entities across India who are certified as AEO Tier 1 and around 540 plus entities who are certified as AEO Tier 2. Now, some of the key benefits which arise out of this AEO scheme are prioritized cargo processing and release, reduced cargo inspections for imports and need-based physical examinations for imports and exports, reduced bank guarantees, which is always a pain when customs asks for bank guarantees, reduction in storage and warehousing expenditure because customs will allow direct port delivery, and prevention of any demurrage. Most important point is mutual recognition by other countries, whereby AEO status is also recognized by other countries and similar benefits are also extended to an importer or an exporter by other countries. So given the several intangible and the tangible commercial benefits offered by the scheme, it would be perhaps a good idea to explore AEO certification for the supply chain and reap all the tangible and intangible benefits which are to offer under this scheme. Moving on, so there are some challenges which I understand from a GST standpoint in the leasing business. I believe one of the key concerns is primarily the rate of GST. Generally, equipment which is leased typically attracts GST at the rate of 18%, which is the rate which is similar to the goods. However, there are certain sectors where these equipments are leased, such as real estate and construction, which typically have a restriction in claiming input tax credit from April 2019. So therefore, I see GST at the rate of 18% on leasing of heavy equipments could act as a deterrent. Now, another challenge has been around the applicability of GST on the interest component in a transaction of a finance lease. Now, in the past, there have been divergent views on this topic in the erstwhile service tax regime. However, the CBIC FAQs in case of GST seems to suggest that GST is applicable on the interest component even in case of a finance lease transaction. Another concern seems to be in the arrangement of interstate sale and leaseback arrangements. There seems to be a challenge in availing input tax credit of GST paid on the sale of asset or equipment when seller and buyer are in different states. This is primarily because of the fact that in case of sale of equipment, there is no movement of equipment to the buyer and it is merely a constructive delivery. Therefore, as per the provisions of place of supply, the place of supply for such sale is considered to be the location of the supplier, which makes the transaction as an intrastate supply and not an interstate supplier, thereby leading to challenges in availing credit for the buyer or the lessor. Overall, perhaps I believe this is an opportune time for advocacy, as government and board are pretty receptive to any policy impediments, and I would feel it would be a good idea to take up any such matters with the government or the board and get a resolution to all of them related to policy. So this is from my side. Thank you so much. And I hand it over to Shrenik for covering the GST invoicing slides. Thank you so much. Over to you, Shrenik.
Hey, thanks, Hardik, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, e-invoicing is a thing of the season. Well, I'm sure you'd all heard about the government identifying GST fraud of more than 45,000 crores in first 30 months of GST implementation, and a large chunk of this fraud was because of fake invoices. Right. So people thought that GST is a failure because look, there are so many frauds happening right now as well. But if you look at it from a different perspective, the fraud could be detected only because of primarily three reasons. One is that there is an invoice level reporting to be done in GSTR 1. In parallel, there is also a requirement to do input tax credit reconciliation. And then government introduced e-way bills somewhere down the road, because of which the transactions could be identified and government could identify what are the transactions which are taking place between two parties. So no, with the success of these identification of frauds and they having a overall view of the transaction happening, the government is embarking on again a bold journey of e-invoicing. What e-invoicing means is basically each B2B transaction will be pre-authenticated by the government. And when I say pre-authenticated, this means that the transaction or the invoices, before they are formally issued to a customer, they need to be reported to a central portal set up by the government. And the government portal will issue an invoice registration number or IRN. And only if the invoice has an IRN, it will be considered to be a valid invoice. So by doing this, the government is ensuring that the input tax credit is allowed in future only on the invoices which are reported to it. If there's any invoice which is not reported, the credit should not be allowed. Well, while we'll go to the mechanism in a bit, essentially the plan is that right now implementation will be restricted only to a few companies whose turnover in FY20 exceeded 500 crores. And the turnover includes your branch transfer as well. So the members of ICIMA need to see whether they actually cross the threshold in FY20. Certain sectors have been kept outside of the invoicing. So banks, NBFCs, insurance, etc. Have been specifically kept outside of invoicing. But eventually, the indications are that these sectors, along with the B2C supplies in the smaller companies, will also form part of the whole invoicing. The whole mechanism works in a manner where the taxpayer shares details of invoices in a given format. The government portal validates it. After validation, it assigns a unique reference number using an algorithm, and that is given back to the taxpayer. And the taxpayer is required to print the QR code shared by the government on the face of the invoice. And this QR code can be verified using a mobile application. So the tax officer can pick up an invoice and see whether it is valid or not, whether it is reported to the government portal or not. Well, this is if this initiative is implemented successfully, it's definitely going to result in a significant digital transformation of the way in which the businesses function, and we'll see in next few months how the initiative goes. Moving on to the next slide. Here, I've tried to explain how invoice exactly works. On the left side, what you see is the seller or the supplier. The details of the transaction are required to be entered into a file called schema, and the schema file gets shared to the government portal. As I mentioned earlier, the government portal validates the file. It validates whether the transaction is reported to it for the first time and whether the GST numbers are correct or not. If everything is fine, the transaction is validated. A unique reference number or IRN is assigned to the invoice, and the details are sent back to the supplier. Now, what details are sent back? The details are basically in an encrypted JSON file. It contains data of the transaction. It also contains text for the QR code. Now, this text is required to be converted into an image and printed or put on the face of the invoice. Now, taxpayers have got two options. One is that they can directly send the JSON file to the recipients. And if the recipients have got a facility or mechanism to read the JSON files, they can directly ingest those files into their ERP. But considering that all the systems are not so mature today, the government is advising that you continue using your existing mechanism of sending either PDF or a printed copy of the invoice and have a QR code on the invoices. So in parallel, what the government is also doing that in case of supply of goods, an e-way will also be automatically generated using the data which is shared for invoicing. And also the GSTR1, which is the outward supply return, will also be automatically populated using the data which is shared. So you share data only once, and all your requisite returns or forms are filled in based on that data. This is going to result in a significant reduction in efforts for filing of GSTR1. While I understand that initially there is requirement for a reconciliation because the B2C transactions do not form part of e-invoicing mechanism. But eventually, after the system settles down, there's going to be a significant reduction in the efforts to populate the returns. In parallel, the recipient will also be able to see these transactions in their GSTR2A or ANX2 when ANX2 is implemented. Currently, it is put in abeyance. So essentially, what happens is that the taxpayers get benefited because of the automation of the invoicing processes. You report the transaction only once, and all the requisite forms or documents get generated. And eventually, it will also result in reduction of mismatches in the input tax credit. So all in all, it's going to be a beneficial initiative by the government. We'll have to see how it gets implemented on 1st of October. And as I move on the next slide, the invoicing is not just a tax event, it's going to have a far-reaching implication on the overall business. And when I say business, it's not just the operations, it's going to have an implication on IT as well. For example, there's going to be a real-time reporting, and real-time reporting envisages that the data that you generate from the ERP has to be correct at the first time, because if an incorrect or non-validated data is reported to the government, it could potentially be rejecting the transaction, and it could also result in delay in deliveries and other implications on trade. It will also require a relook at the reporting mechanism and the internal controls. This is because if you plan to have an invoice issued centrally to your customers, then the whole invoicing mechanism which is being carried out today needs to be relooked at. And perhaps the largest implication on the whole thing is going to be from an IT perspective, because integration of the government portal with the ERP that you use, it's going to be quite crucial. Let's say the ERP does not have sufficient controls or does not have a robust validation mechanism. Again, there's going to be a challenge in issuing of invoices going forward. So the suggestion is that having a robust mechanism and a tight integration with the ASP GSP provider is something which is quite crucial and important. Last but not the least, the working capital, there's definitely going to be a significant impact, because going forward, the input tax credit will be available only when the invoices get reflected in your inward returns. And let's say, while you all are large companies and you will have a control on your outward supply, inward supply is something which is important and where we need to be careful of, because the vendors, if they do not report their invoices properly, there's going to be a rejection of input tax credit. So having said that, there are many open questions as on today. For example, let's say when a vendor who files a quarterly return, how will the ITC get impacted? Because in that case, the invoices get reflected only on a quarterly basis, and this means that the input tax credit can be taken only on a quarterly basis. Similarly, certain industries which were kept outside of e-invoicing initially, now we've been hearing from the GSTN that only the core businesses of these industries will be outside of e-invoicing. The non-core operations will be required to comply with e-invoicing, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, this is a significant and quite important digital journey which the government is moving on. But at the same time, there are challenges. What's important for industry and member of ICMA is that since the government is moving at fast pace, we should also have a pace which is matching them, so as to catch up on the important or essential amendments in the law. That's it from my side. I'll hand over to Jimit for taking on some interesting ideas for direct tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrenik. So from moving from indirect tax to direct tax, but before we start on the direct tax, to all of, if you have any question and answer, please do type in your chat box. We will to answer that at the end of the session. So coming to direct tax, what we have done is we have broken up into charts in next 30 odd minutes. We will discuss that into 3 parts. One is cash conservation ideas. Second is some thoughts on manufacturing in India, which is the new provision, and of course some ideas around it. And the third are the recent amendments. So if we do into cash conservation ideas, the first idea which we are thoughting today, especially in COVID times, the key thing is obtaining lower withholding tax orders where basically cash is the king. And today, if we are rendering any services to various service providers, and the service provider, we receive our payments from them, at that point they withhold various taxes either at 2% or 10%. And how do we ensure that we ensure that we get full cash and optimum utilize our cash? And that is why what you can do, approach the tax department and actually get lower withholding tax orders. Even if you have not obtained such orders in the past, you can still approach, because during these COVID times, it is possible that your tax margins or net profit margins would have reduced and you may be in a refund situation. Rather being in a refund situation and then waiting for your refunds from the tax department, which may take some time, in order to conserve cash, you may actually explore this option if you have not explored this in the past. So that is a very important thing in lower withholding tax orders. Second thing which we have also seen is many a times, as Indian companies, we make payments to various non-resident parties. And commercially, it is decided that the Indian party is going to bear the taxes. What we can also do is that in such scenario, it is advisable to look at is the non-resident rendering the services, which country they have been to, whether there is any tax treaty which is beneficial, and then try to claim the benefits under the tax treaty and then go and obtain the department, so that the cost on that can be saved, which could be around 10 to 15%. So that is what we have seen. A lot of the companies right now is doing both these things in order to conserve cash. Apart from that, to get cash, the next thing which many of the companies right now are doing is obtaining their tax refunds. And you would have seen that government is also right now issuing income tax refunds because of the COVID situation. And there has been a recent Supreme Court judgment as well, which has that even if there are assessment proceedings initiated, you can still get a refund unless there are some valid reasons which the tax officers have to produce. Otherwise, you will still get refunds even if your case is selected for scrutiny. Generally, this never used to be the case. Generally, if your notice is issued to you, your refunds were actually stuck when the assessment was over. But now, with this decision and the government also being liberal, if your refunds are stuck with the department, and especially of past years, I would say this is the best time to get your refunds from the tax department and get more cash into the system. The third option, which is actually not an option, is also, today we as companies make withholding tax payments. We deduct tax from various parties and deposit that into the government treasury on a month basis, which is 7th of next month. There is already a provision in Income Tax Act that today, for whatever reason, if you have a genuine case, approach the department. Instead of depositing the tax on a monthly basis, you can actually deposit the tax on a quarterly basis without. So basically, you are getting an option of deferral by 2 months. And you will, of course, before doing this, you will have to go and approach the tax department, take their approval, And then and only then you can exercise this option. But we have seen many companies trying to do this. Those companies who are affected by COVID and who are able to justify that, okay, they have suffered a lot because of COVID, and that is why this option of deferral should be accepted by the department. So these are the three cash conservation ideas which are perfectly legitimate, and which we do see a lot of using this. Moving from the cash conservation idea, let's move to the other new ideas or thoughts which are quite recent. If we go to the next slide, this, of course, government has always been promoting manufacturing for a very simple reason, is that government wants India to be a manufacturing hub with Make in India initiative, because it promotes a lot of employment. And that is why the government wants all the foreign companies to set up their manufacturing bases in India. And the war between the US, the Cold War between US and China, India wanted to become a very good destination. And that is why India introduced a new manufacturing regime, I would say a tax regime, by which the tax rate was reduced to 15%, provided you have a new Indian company and you begin manufacturing. After 1st October 2019, you set up your company, and then there's of course an end date before which you need to commence your manufacturing. Before that is 31st March 2023. Of course, won't be also subject to minimum alternate tax here. So 15% will be your final tax. Government also came out with certain clarifications as to what amounts to manufacturing and what doesn't amount to manufacturing. At the same time, it has also kept open certain ideas that in case tomorrow somebody wants to include themselves in manufacturing, they can of course go and represent before the government and try to see if they can be included in manufacturing. So there are various incentives which the government wants it, and that is why it would be great, if you have explored whether this option or not. Sometimes you are already into manufacturing, but say you are into an expansion mode. You want to set up a new unit. Then the question will always arise is that, okay, should I continue under the same company? Because you will not be, of course, paying 15% if you are under the same company. Does it make sense that, okay, I open a new company and do expansion, then whether, I will get this benefit or not? I should also, warn you, some of the companies also explored that, okay, let me close down my existing manufacturing, shift everything to a new unit, and let me claim a lower rate of tax. They were exploring, of course, there were huge amount of commercial difficulties in that also. But anyway, the tax does not allow you to do that, because you are not allowed to split your existing business or reconstruct your existing business and shift that to the new company. Then you won't get your 15%. There are certain conditions prescribed, which you will have to satisfy. So you cannot happen that you close down your existing unit, you shift all your people under the new unit and try to claim the 15% benefit. My manufacturing also is a matter of huge debate. While government has clarified some things will be decided by judicial precedents on manufacturing. There are also other interesting issues, when somebody wants to claim this benefit. As to, before manufacturing, there is always trial production which happens. And say we are at the close of 31st March 2023, and you will be knowing that I'll be, by now, who's are into manufacturing, they'll know that I will at least take 2 to 3 years to manufacture. So, they will be planning for that. And you will say, okay, can I start my trial production before 31st of March, and then will it amount to manufacturing or not? That we will have to analyze based on judicial precedents. Second thing, that today, say you are opening up a new unit, let's say a new company, and because you are expanding. But that company and your existing plant are very close to each other. The factory area, the land area is very, say, next to each other. Can you say that, okay, because I've opened a new company, can I get this 15% or not? Sometimes your manufacturing has various phases, phase 1, phase 3. Say you completed your phase 1 and phase 2 by 31st March 2023. Can you say that you've started the manufacturing and phase 3 is actually just an extension, and that is why you will be eligible for 15? All these factors will, of course, require, it's a fact-based, and you need to evaluate things based on your factual. Then you can explore whether you can get this 15% benefit or not. Okay. So these are all the issues which I thought I'll put it before you on manufacturing. But if you have any further questions, would be happy to answer that at the end of the session. Apart from manufacturing, if we move to the next thing, I wanted to just leave you with 2 or 3 thoughts before we move to the next topic. Is that apart in manufacturing, there were these 3 ideas which we wanted to just is that today this government was criticized that they were not generating enough employment, whether rightly or wrongly. So government came out with an incentive, a particular incentive under this act, and this incentive is actually not a new incentive. This was there 3-4 years ago. Time this very stringent, so many companies did not qualify for this incentive, and that is why then government came out with certain amendments in a year and a half back, and now we do see lots of companies eligible for this 80JJAA, and that is why many of these companies are already claiming this benefit also. What's the simple benefit under this is that in case there is a net increase in your number of employees, and say the employees are less than drawing salary less than 25,000 per month, then basically if you spend 100, you get 190 as a deduction. So you get almost double, full 25% is a directly addition to the net profit, and this can continue on a year-on-year basis also. So this is a very important provision. Very important thing to notice that government has also come out with a new of lower tax of 22% also. Under that regime also, this benefit is allowable. While no other benefits are allowable under the new tax regime of 22%, 80JJAA is specifically allowed. So you can actually further reduce your rate. Say you are not into manufacturing, but you don't qualify as manufacturing because of under the provisions, but you are going under 22% rate. You can still go ahead and claim 80JJAA. So this is certainly a benefit worth exploring if you have not explored this in the past. The second thing which we have thought is on the education cess. Today question arises that education cess is a part of normal tax. So generally income tax is not allowed as a deduction. So logically even education cess should not be allowed. In fact, education cess amounts to 4% of our tax. That's the education cess rate. But what had happened is the manner in which the provisions were drafted, and there were certain provisions. I don't want to go into much detail, but a cess was included in the draft, but in the final it was removed. There were contrary judicial precedents on whether education cess can be allowed as a deduction or not. And now there are 2 High Court decisions, the Bombay and the Rajasthan High Court decisions, which have stated that education cess should be allowed. So we see many of the companies exploring this benefit, that okay, whether they can go ahead and claim this education cess, depending on the quantum involved, whether they have the appetite to litigate, and then taking a call on this on education cess, because when there are High Court decisions in favor, the chances of penalties are not there. That doesn't mean litigation is not there, but chances of penalty are not there. So we do see a lot of companies exploring this benefit, and if you believe it's relevant, you may also explore that. Coming to the last, I wanted to discuss on the dividend. This part of the presentation is that today, before 31st of March, there were dividend distribution tax, which was around 80%. Now the same has been changed to dividend withholding, so which has gone back to pre-1998 days, where instead of tax being paid by the company, the tax is on the shareholder, and the tax rate normally is 20%. But under the tax treaty, so this benefit is actually useful for all those who are subsidiaries of companies and not necessarily companies. So if you are a subsidiary of a foreign company, and if you are declaring dividend, under the treaty could go down to even 10%, in certain cases even 5%, because of certain most beneficial or most favored nation clause also. Of course, there which you need to satisfy of beneficial ownership and everything. But certainly from an earlier regime where dividend was not considered as a good creation mechanism, now lot of companies declaring dividend to their parent company need, and also trying to explore this benefit of lower tax of 5 or 10% as well. Moving to the next section, I wanted to discuss and leave with recent amendments, which will be very, very relevant for all of you. I have to cover 4 amendments in that. The first important amendment on Vivad Se Vishwas. This is a scheme. Government earlier came out with an indirect tax resolution scheme, dispute resolution scheme, and which was specifically only for tax. With the success of the scheme, government also brought in this Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. Earlier, of course, the time limit was very short because they introduced in February. They wanted everybody to pay tax by 31st of March. But COVID situations, the dates got extended, and now the date is still 31st of December 2020. Where what's the scheme is basically you pay up your taxes, but don't pay any interest penalty. And I personally believe this is a very good scheme, especially for all those companies, where certain companies had taken positions. At the time of taking positions, maybe their claim was valid because there were debatable issues. But say post that filing of return, there is a Supreme Court decision which clearly says that that claim is not available. So if the company is still proceeding and litigating up to a tribunal, it's very likely they will lose. But they will also be levied penalty and there will be interest. It is better that they may go under this scheme and settle the amount, because in which case they are safeguarding their interest and penalty. Sometimes some of the companies whose matters are still very not clear, whether there is a 50-50 chance. Those companies also, if the matters are say 6 years old or 8 years old, they may also want to explore this benefit just to avoid litigation and safeguard, because the interest, which is almost like 12 to 18% annum, in 5 to 6 years will be almost equivalent amount to the tax which you are going to pay. So might as well explore and see if you want to really litigate and face that interest exposure and penalty litigation, or do you want to just pay off the tax and settle it. We have also seen certain companies, those who are planning into liquidation, and they and before going for liquidation, they need to settle and get a no objection. Those companies are also trying to get under the scheme and close the matter. And some of the companies also, just because there are 1 or 2 matters which are pending, that is affecting their contingent liability in their balance sheet or in the provisions in the balance sheet. And they don't want this to happen. And that is why they are saying, okay, let me go under the scheme. I'm free of all the litigation because it was only a 1-year issue or whatever. Let me go under the scheme and settle under the scheme, because then I will not have interest and penalty. One very good thing about this is that even if you withdraw or settle under the scheme, that will not be treated as a precedent by the department when in future years this case comes up. So that issue is not there. You of course need to close all this, or Vivad Se Vishwas, get an order, pay everything before 31st of December. The dates have already been extended, but I don't see this getting further extended. Moving to the next slide, we have just highlighted some of the issues in which are there under Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. Is say what losses, and now I want to settle. Then possibly your losses will get reduced, but you don't have to pay, but your litigation can go away. So many of the companies are going that because it is possible that they did an analysis that anyway I'm not going to utilize my losses in 8 years. Might as well settle under this scheme, get relief to my litigation, possible. You will also get refunds, but without interest once you settle under this scheme. Then if you have a prior year appeal in your favor, then there are clarifications that you need to pay only a percentage of the amount and not the full amount. If it's a department appeal, the answer is different. If it's an assessee's appeal, the answer is different. Sometimes there are issues or survey issues that also can be litigated, settled under the scheme. So there are a lot of clarifications also government is issued. So in my view, all those companies who have litigation should certainly consider this scheme, and maybe consciously, if they don't consider this scheme because they believe that their case is very strong or for whatever reason, they can consciously say, okay, I don't want to go under this scheme, rather than just rejecting the scheme on a face value. At least do that analysis before coming to a conclusion whether they should opt for the scheme or not opt for the scheme. And this is, I would say, a very good one-time settlement scheme that will go away. Coming to the next thing which we discussed is all these company of ICMA members understand is that you also do a lot of leasing. Now, with the leasing and the MAT and the Ind AS on leasing, which is coming up, there are certain issues in and around leasing. Because earlier, what used to happen, say under operating lease, you used to debit your lease expense, nothing, that was allowed as an expense, and matter was very simple. Now, if no is applicable to you, then you actually need to break up your leasing of lease into two parts. One is into your right to use, and one is into your interest expense, and then evaluate the impact on that. And the question, there are various issues when such things happen. What happens, whether I will get a depreciation, what I have debited to my balance sheet as right to use, whether I will get depreciation under 32 or will I not get, or whether my treatment under income tax remains the same. What happens that today there are thin capitalization norms. Under these thin capitalization norms, the benefit is restricted to 30% of EBITDA. Now EBITDA is based on books, but under that, if you go under this 116 scheme, your book classification of lease rental is interest, and amortization is charged, the expense. Then how does your EBITDA changes or EBITDA doesn't change? What happens in case of 11UA valuation? Because your 11UA books and here also you record as SLR, whether you need to go change your 11UA valuation or you have to go as per balance sheet, whatever you prepared in accordance with Ind AS 116. What happens when you're computing your MAT liabilities? Whether this amendments which you're making into 116, whether that will amount to revaluation. Can recognizing the right to use of asset in balance sheet will be considered as revaluation? In my view, I don't think so. It will be considered as revaluation. But that is what all these issues you will have to discuss whenever you are finalizing your computation of liability and paying of your taxes. Another issue which could also arise is like lease rentals are now split up into interest, finance cost, and amortization. Then whether this amortization cost will form part of unabsorbed depreciation, and whether finance cost will be part of business loss, because the impact is business depreciation, unabsorbed depreciation is allowed to be carried definitely, and finance cost is business loss, and that is of course for books. But when you compute a MAT, there is a lower of unabsorbed depreciation and business loss. Where will you classify? How how will you classify, and what will be the impact on that? So this are all the issues you will have to take into account when you are finalizing, and if you are subject to Ind AS 116. So that is one of the thoughts which I wanted to leave. Coming to the next, and this is just give just 2 to 3 minutes. So wanted to leave with you two ideas or two thoughts or recent amendments which will be relevant to good amount of you. Government has introduced tax collection at source in the budget, and it is going to be effective 1st October instead of possibly some of them might have bring this to effect. The important part is issues even in TCS as to, there are certain issues in and around on TCS of applicability. How do you calculate the 50 lakh limit, whether it is from 1st April or 1st October, whether it is on invoice amount or actual receipt of goods. What happens in case of bad debts. So there are various issues in and around it, and you need to relating to TCS and make changes, amendment to your IT system as well, because today all your IT systems will be geared up only for withholding tax payments, that is your tax deducted at source. Now you need to also make appropriate amendments to systems and SAP system payments also, so that from 1st October you are compliant with the provisions of the law. And the last thing is on equalization levy. Of course, the question arises that why equalization levy? Because equalization levy is only for our online service provider. It wants to tackle on e-commerce operators, and maybe the answer to that is yes. That was the intention when the government introduced the provisions of equalization levy, that they wanted to tackle all the e-commerce operators, maybe the Googles, the Facebook, the Amazons of the world. But the manner in which it is drafted, it's so widely drafted that today, good amount of your companies where you are subsidiaries of the foreign company, you may be receiving certain management services from your parent company, you will be making certain payments such as legal fees, SAP fees, HR fees, corporate allocation, and that intercompany charges. You may or may not be withholding the tax under royalty or FTS, depending on your treaties, depending on the position you take, whether it is 10% or 0%. The question which arises is that, okay, and the manner in which these services are rendered are also online. Sometimes some of the services are rendered through portals which are internal. Some of the services are rendered through emails, and the wordings which are used are online. So the question which arises is that, okay, in case of intercompany charges, whether an equalization levy is also applicable, and if yes, that is levied at 2% on the non-resident. So is it okay if I just a non-resident pay 2%? In which case, whether they have to pay 10% or they don't have to pay 10%. So all such issues you will have to take into account. This equalization is already effective on 1st April 2020. So in case this, the subsidiaries of the foreign company have not explored this, you will want to discuss this with your parent and take appropriate calls and take this forward. So I think so. This is the pointers which I wanted to discuss you all on a broad thing. If you have further clarifications, of course, we will try to answer this during a Q&A questions. But for whatever reason, if the time limit is short and we are not able to answer that questions, happy that offline our details are already with your ICMA members, and we will be happy to answer all the questions. So over to you, Bela, for the Q&A.
Thank you, Jimit, and thank you, Hardik and Shrenik, for the detailed presentation. We do have some questions that have come in, some responses as well have gone, but I think it'd be good if we discuss them. So, Hardik, this question that we got around, the requirements and guidelines on control and supervision for inbound manufacturing. Do you just want to explain how it works and, practically? I know the understanding is government is willing to sort of look at relaxations and not be very stringent around it, is what we understand. So what are your views on that, Hardik? You want to share something more than what you typed in?
Yeah, sure. So essentially the whole scheme of inbound manufacturing is based on the concept and the philosophy of self-regulation and self-assessment. All of the records and registers which are required to be maintained can be maintained electronically and can be filed electronically. The whole idea was that there should not be any physical control over the premises or even for the movement of goods from the warehouse, from or within the warehouse or in the warehouse. However, there has been a slight change by notification number 75 by 2020, Red Bill Circular 36 by 2020, which both of them came on 17th of August, just 3 days back, which said that now there will be a concept of a bond officer which will be appointed, and this bond officer will supervise the warehouse and will also supervise the movement of goods in and out of the warehouse. So it seems that now there is a slight change in the process whereby the warehouse keeper, which will be appointed by the owner of, or the person who has taken the permission, will have to go to the bond officer to get those all procedural formalities. There is also a concept whereby a one-time lock also has to be affixed on the goods which are stored and even on the transportation of the goods. There is also now a concept whereby specified goods will have to be stored in the strong room. There is a list of specified dutiable goods which is already prescribed, and no other goods can be stored in that strong room. Apart from that, there are audit provisions which are there, which as applicable under customs. So seems to be a slight change from the overall scheme and the philosophy of which was there till before 17th of August. So we will have to see how this bond officer thing will work and whether it will create any impediment in the whole process and the time taken to sort of document everything.
Okay, thank you, Hardik. Moving track from there, I think there were a couple of questions around, will there be an extension to invoicing? And in our view, based on our interactions with the the government has sort of made it known, and they have held a number of webinars where they have clearly said that 1st October is the date when they want to go live for the turnover limit about 500 crores. So we don't see that, at least in my view, I don't think that there will be an extension. to that. And in fact, they're quite keen to introduce it even for the other companies as well. But they first want this to stabilize, and then they will bring it to the other companies. So we do expect that to move quickly if this stabilizes fast. Shrenik, there were certain other questions around e-way bill generation and cancellation. So can you just take those up? If e-way bill is already generated, can it be cancelled? And those other questions that you responded to, will you take that up, please, Shrenik?
Yeah, sure, Bela. So since this is an integrated mechanism where e-invoicing and e-way bill for goods move hand in hand, if for an e-invoice and e-way bill is already been generated, then one first needs to cancel the e-way bill and then cancel the IRN or e-invoicing. Because if you cancel one and not cancel the other one, that's going to be an anomaly in the system and it could result in a reconciliation error. But in a case where only e-invoice is generated but e-way bill is not applicable, it's not been generated for some reason, then you can directly cancel the e-invoicing.
Okay. And there was another question, Shrenik, related to compliances. Will same returns be maintained or new forms of returns be implemented? How will auto-population happen under GSTR 1 and 3B? So you just want to explain that a bit more, the new return?
Sure. So there have been seminars organized by GSTN and NIC on e-invoicing and new return related mechanisms. What they've explained is that the new return system has been kept in abeyance, which means that it will not be implemented immediately to avoid an overhaul of the whole return system, because the taxpayers have just got familiarized with the whole system of 3B, two-way reconciliation, etc. They'll make changes to the existing return system. They're planning to introduce a new return called GSTR 2B, where it will be drawn on a static basis and based on the cutoff taken or cutoff date, the return will be populated. In addition to that, the returns which are not interlinked today will also be interlinked, which means that the data which is flown into GSTR 1 by the taxpayers will automatically flow to GSTR 3B. While there'll be a room for making amendments and changes, but if there are no changes, the returns will largely be auto-populated for all inward as well as outward supplies.
Right. Thanks, Shrenik. There's another question actually addressed. Is will there be any income tax benefits if implemented under inbound manufacturing? So the inbound manufacturing scheme is under indirect taxes. But Jimit, you can sort of explain how you can use the lower manufacturing rate to get the benefit under income tax as well.
Yeah, so if for claiming a manufacturing unit or benefit under the income tax, you will have to independently evaluate whether you are satisfying the conditions as per the Income Tax Act. Merely because you are eligible for an indirect tax benefit on inbound manufacturing scheme, that will not automatically grant you an exemption or a benefit or an income tax benefit also. You will have to independently evaluate this benefit from income tax perspective, whether you are satisfying the conditions of setting up a new company post 1st October, whether you qualify as manufacturing definition under the Income Tax Act, then you will be able to claim the benefit. But it is not interlinked as such, if that answers your question.
Right. So it's a powerful, it's a very, if you have a new unit coming up and you set it up an inbound and you can use the lower CIT rate, and that's how it can become beneficial, from the direct and indirect tax perspective. Ajima, the related question which we have been hearing and, which comes up is, will it be considered as splitting up a reconstruction of business for new manufacturing deduction if a few employees and some assets are transferred from existing to new business?
So the answer to that would be no. And the reason is because there is a specific benefit where they are saying that, there should not be splitting up or reconstruction of business. The idea of this provision, actually, the government was to encourage more and more new units to be set up under this, rather than existing units just closing down their existing units and setting up a new company to claim the benefit. So the government will not look at it correctly, and possibly the benefit will be denied if somebody tries to do that.
Okay, so you need to be very careful before claiming that. Shrenik, on e-invoicing, can you share some, practical insights on the challenges and, timing and, what should people be doing around e-invoicing, since now, you know, it's just about a month away?
All right. So the biggest challenge or the issue is that the timing, because while the government has issued a notification for e-invoicing to be applicable to companies more than 500 crores, but there are a lot many issues which still need a clarity. For example, as I mentioned in my presentation, uh, certain sectors have been excluded. For example, financial services, but then there are indications on webinars saying that only core business of these entities have been excluded. Similarly, what we notice is that there are last minute changes to the schema or the information which is required for e-invoicing, and which also results in delay of the whole project, because the ERP system also needs to undergo change to cater to those changes in the schema. Apart from that, what's important is that there should be a solid and very robust validation mechanism so that the transactions do not get rejected, because time is going to be an essence. While the government has been promising that the e-invoice or the IRN will return in less than 2 seconds, but at the same time, it's essential that when we send the transaction to the government for the first time, they get accepted and they get validated. So these are some of the crucial changes that we see. And then apart from that, timing, as well as for especially for leasing companies, we've seen issues coming in where when the goods are sent in installments or on batches, there is no clarity as to what should be the treatment from an e-waybill as well as e-invoicing perspective.
This is one last question we'll take before we end. These are manufacturers of construction equipments. If we raise a tax invoice and the equipment is not dispatched, and if we intend to cancel the invoice, are there procedures, and what are they? So Shrenik, if you could respond to that.
So one first, if the invoice is issued but not shared with the government portal, then it can be cancelled and did not be sent to the IRP. But if the IRN has already been sent to the government portal, you have a 24 hours time window within which one can cancel it. After that, if there's any change which is required to be done, let's say the IRN is generated and it's already reached the recipient, one will have to issue a debit or a credit note, as the case may be.
Thank you, Shrenik. We are almost top of the hour, and there was one request whether this presentation will be shared. So it will be shared with ICIMA, and you can get in touch with them. So with that, I once again thank ICIMA for providing the opportunity to be the knowledge partner for this webinar. We hope that you all have found it useful. And I hand it over to Mr. Sandeep Ghosh for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Bela. Bela, Hardik, Shrenik, and Jimit, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you so much for your very, very deep insights and indirect and direct taxes around, the COVID impact and also the liquidity opportunities. You could not be much more descriptive in this short span of time. So thank you very much. I'm sure all our members have benefited quite a bit. Probably there are certain questions which have not been answered due to paucity of time, due to the limitations. I'm sure all of you would be writing back to the participants in terms of any questions which are unanswered. And all participants must feel free to write into the ICIMA office for any queries, suggestions, feedback, etc. And yeah, Bela, you wanted to say something?
So I should have said that we will respond to the questions that are there in the chat box, and if there are some unanswered ones, we will definitely respond to them.
Thank you so much, and I must also take this opportunity in thanking all the participants for taking their busy time out from the busy schedule and joining this webcast. And once again, a big thank you to all of you. And a special thank you to Seema, who is our Secretary General, and her office consisting of Paramita, who both of them have really, facilitated the whole process and even the ideation process. And a big thank you to our convener, Jaswinder, for putting this together. So once again, to all of you, we had a great session.
We lost Sandeep. Yes.
So thank you, one and all. We had a great session, and we look forward to such sessions in the future too.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.